the tech aspect of today's program. So thank you to Joe, and also to Marianne de Padua, who will be running our program on teaching Black history with her work on behalf of the New York Historical Society. So thank you for joining us, and let's get started. I'm doing a screen share. You should all be able to see the screen share. Thank you if you have your cameras on. You're welcome to have your cameras on. And if you're more comfortable turning them off, that's fine too. What we're going to do is we're going to start out our program this afternoon. I'm going to do a brief overview, a welcome, some introductions, and talk a little bit about the perspective of teaching Black history from the perspective of a college professor and a historian and a teacher educator. I'm then going to turn over the program to Marianne de Padua, who's going to be talking about how to teach and introducing you to some new topics, new materials to work with, and new lesson plans. We do have a chat room or the chat function open and functioning on this Zoom program, and you're welcome to either ask questions throughout the program by turning your mic on, or if you're not comfortable with that, you can type a question or a comment in the chat. So the chat is open, it's functioning. We're happy to have you use it and participate actively in our program this afternoon. Okay, so to start out is the main question. What are the challenges of teaching Black history in the Black Lives Matter era? In other words, what are the challenges for teaching about Black history today? What are the challenges of using technology today? Okay, there we are. So as you all probably know, Black Lives Matter refers to a movement that was founded in 2013 by 3 women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They were creating this program. It was really a movement that came together in the wake of the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who murdered Trayvon Martin in 2012. In their own words, Black Lives Matter is a political and ideological intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity, our contributions to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. Okay, so here is a quick reminder, right? Refresher of the Black Lives Matter movement, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And what we know about Black Lives Matter is that it took off as an idea. It was inspirational, and a lot of people became active in the movement, especially young people. And many of these young people are students. They're students in high school and middle school, they're students in college. And of course, this affected their families as well. So by this time, many of our students have participated in Black Lives Matter protests and movement. They're certainly aware of the hashtag. They're seeing stories and ideas trend. They're participating in different ways in this movement. And it's really invigorated, I think, the Black civil rights movement in the 21st century. So this is very exciting, and this is an exciting moment in which to be teaching Black history. It's also a challenging moment. And you, I'm sure, have not missed the recent attacks on teaching about not only Black history, but also related subjects like race, racism, racial inequality, racial oppression, and racial injustice. Now, for many of us, these discussions about racism and racial oppression are part of, an intrinsic part of, the study of Black history. And it's impossible to teach Black history without talking about racial inequality and racial oppression. And yet here we are in this moment where conservatives have organized and have dedicated a serious amount of resources and energy and organization to mobilizing white families in particular, and convincing these white families that something called critical race theory is being taught in schools and that it is dangerous to their children. And so we have enormous amounts of anti-Black activism from these white conservatives who go to school board meetings, they call their state legislators, they call their representatives in Congress, and they're demanding changes to local, state, and federal laws about education. By this time, at least 8 states have passed laws limiting instruction about racial equality and racism in public schools, and many other school boards have passed their own resolutions trying to limit discussions of these topics which they deem controversial. So this has created a new and very uncomfortable climate for a lot of teachers. For some people, you teach in a very progressive school, in a very progressive community, and these concerns are not as visible. For other people, you teach in a more conservative community, and all of a sudden there's a new fear about how to teach Black history, how to do it in a way that is both fair and accurate, but that's not going to get teachers into trouble and somehow break the law. So this is the context we find ourselves in today, and it is certainly a challenging one. But I think it's important to balance a recognition that there's this increased scrutiny of how we teach about Black history and racial inequality, and an increased interest. And that interest comes to us from our students. Our students are at what I would say in my own teaching career is an all-time high in terms of their interest in understanding the Black civil rights movement and movements for racial equality and social justice more broadly. So there's a real opportunity here to connect with students, and not just Black students, but a lot of students who have become interested in this movement, who see themselves as allies, and who want to participate actively and understand movements for racial justice and racial equality in American history. This brings us to our program today. And one of our goals here today is to help revitalize history instruction in public schools. And one of the things we want to do is talk about new scholarship in Black civil rights history. And we have some resources that we're going to share with you as part of this program, with links to books and journal articles that represent cutting edge and interesting new scholarship in Black civil rights history. Historians now refer to something they call the long civil rights movement. This was a term that was coined by a historian named Jacqueline Dowd Hall. And her point was that too many historians, and especially the way US history textbooks have traditionally taught the Black civil rights movement, too many histories limit the Black civil rights movement by bookending it between 1954, which was the Brown versus Board of Education movement, and the early 1970s, when you have essentially the rise of Black power, controversies and fighting over school desegregation and busing in the North, and the kind of what is presented as the falling apart or the deterioration of the Black civil rights movement after the Black power era. Historians can now look back on this history and say, this is just an inaccurate framing. That's not correct, it's not productive, and it's not useful. And by trying to look at something we call the long civil rights movement, it helps us to put that brief period of activism in that 20-year period into a much longer and more complex and more accurate context. And so that's something that we're trying to help you all do today. So the first thing we have to do is challenge that time period. We have to look at Black civil rights activism and struggle for equality that goes way back. Nicole Hannah-Jones would have us put it at 1619, the moment the first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia, and immediately started to fight against systems of racial oppression in this country, and forward, of course, to the present day, where we still have a vital and very active Black civil rights movement. We need to look beyond to the South. So Black civil rights movement isn't something that just happened down in Mississippi and Alabama, but it's something that happened in Montclair, New Jersey, and New York City, and throughout the country. We need to have a global understanding of how ideas and things that were taking place across the globe influenced activists here in the United States. The history of Black nationalism is vital to understanding civil rights history. Too many people look at the Black power era and imagine that this moment of Black nationalism emerged out of the blue, and that it was very short-lived. That's not accurate, and we now know there was a long tradition of Black nationalism that stretched back into the 18th century and even earlier, and of course still extends to the present day. Too many of our traditional narratives of Black civil rights history focus on a very small cast of great heroes in the movement, These are, of course, great heroes, and we're always happy to talk about them, but it is, I think, very helpful and important to expand that cast of characters, especially by investigating the important role that women played in the movement, that young people, including high school students, played in the movement, and that queer and gay activists played in the movement. Challenging things to recover historically, but historians have been doing that work, and we're ready for teachers to bring it into the classroom. Historians are interested in grappling with diversity in the Black civil rights movement, and that's something that I've tackled in a new book that just came out this year that examines debates within Northern Black communities over the question of whether school integration or separate Black-controlled schools offer a better way to reform education and achieve educational equality. There's debates, right? These debates are there, they're interesting, they represent different options on how to secure civil rights and equality. And too many times that those debates are kind of muted and we don't acknowledge positions that don't fit into our standard narrative about nonviolent protest and the moral persuasion that was required for nonviolent activism. Finally, another important point to consider are the constant tensions that have existed between Black civil rights activists and white conservatives. This isn't something that has just popped up today in the year 2021 or with the election of Donald Trump, but that has instead been a constant tension for Black civil rights activists, and it continues to be so today. So these are some of the topics and kind of ideas that have been transforming Black civil rights activism, and some of the ideas that are informing what we're bringing to you today. So in our program today, Ms. Marianne DePadua, who's the Assistant Manager of Professional Learning at the New York Historical Society, is going to be introducing some of the wonderful women activists who are in the Black civil rights movement, but who were active in the period before 1954. So she's going to be expanding our time frame, introducing a new cast of characters, and providing you with some materials and lesson plans to help invigorate your classroom discussions of Black civil rights history. I'm going to be turning the program over to her at this time. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're very excited for our program this afternoon. Marianne?
Thanks so much, Zoe. Thank you all for having me here. It's great to see some familiar faces and to see some new friends in the crowd. I hope that you enjoy the resources, and I hope that you feel comfortable sharing what you think of these sources and the pedagogy that I will model. This is meant to be a very interactive session. We'll be exploring different digital assets, so platforms that we can engage with. So let me start by sharing my screen and then finding all of you and then finding my notes. Okay, can everyone see my screen and the title slide? Great.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so amazing. Okay, so teaching the Black freedom struggle and the Black Lives Matter era, it is amazing to add on to what Zoe has shared right at the top, and how the resources I'll share with you will look at the long civil rights movement, really in the 1920s, but then the new cast of activists you'll learn about were active through the 1920s and even through the 1960s. So some of them lived for quite a long time. How many of you, and if you could share this in the chat, how many of you have ever heard of the New York Historical Society or have ever visited? Great, Yvonne, you have, wonderful. Oh, you have not visited. You've heard of it, great. Went once, awesome. Zoe has been there, great. We've just reopened to 5 days a week. We actually launched our big fall exhibit about RBG, Notorious RBG, Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so please come visit. But we're located in Central, next to Central Park in Manhattan. And we are also New York's first museum and the second oldest museum in the United States. I work within the education division, which provides programs both on-site and free remote programs in our weekly sessions for schools, students, teachers, teens, and families. A lot of the sources that you will be looking at, if you had a chance to read the life stories, they're all from the Women in the American Story free online curriculum guide. And what it is an entire website of different units of different time periods that will connect you as educators, whether you are actively in the classroom right now or preparing to lead your own class in the future. You'll be connected with resources about diverse women's contributions to the American past. I'm really happy to say that this curriculum is the first comprehensive women's history curriculum guide in the United States. And so this comes out of a couple of different avenues. One, that teachers needed a reliable vessel, if you will, of sources for women's history, and also this statistic that only 13% of historical figures in textbooks are women, 13%. And of that 13%, most are white middle class and often only spoken about in the domestic sphere or suffrage. Not to say that those two spaces aren't important, but what WAMS is proving through these sources that we have found in the archives, women have operated at all levels of society from the 1400s to the last unit, which we'll look at 2018. At the moment, we have 6 units out, and we will be launching 2 more units in December. So it's a remote launch if you are interested in seeing new sources. And we are going to be looking at primary sources from Modernizing America towards 1920, and then Confidence in Crises, 1920 to 1948. So really looking at that time period Zoe was mentioning before what we see as that traditional storytelling of the civil rights movement. I hope that you'll see activism is generational, and that through the generations, they have influenced each other. Each unit in Women in the American Story, or WAMS for short, includes images and documents that you will engage with today, life stories that you've seen, so biographies of real women at about 1,000 words written for a middle school through high school level, classroom applications, STEM integration, art activities, and you don't have to be an art teacher to incorporate an activity into your classroom. I don't have any art making skills, to be honest, but the workshops are great. They include things like making a zine or making a print with affordable materials. The resources include high resolution images, document transcription, so you will see that. Background information, so if you're just curious about a source, you can read that, and we have the citations, the books we've listed, we have vocabulary, discussion questions, activities, and then in the classroom, we have a really nice formatting where you can print the sources for yourselves and your students. And so I want to frame these resources as classroom ready. We understand that teachers are doing the most all the time in a difficult time as well. So we want to make sure that if you're teaching the American Revolution, don't stop what you're doing. Don't get rid of all of the sources you have to touch on, but you can add the public declaration by women protesting tea when you're talking about the Boston Tea Party. Why not include a woman's story or switch out a white man's story for a woman's story? So we give you so many options. Okay, so if you have any questions about the curriculum, let us know. You have links in the chat to explore on your own. And throughout the session, I'll share those, we'll share those links of what you'll see on the screen. But the first thing I want to try out with all of you is something called Mentimeter. Has anyone ever used Mentimeter before for a poll or for anything like that? Okay, so we'll try it today. I think, Zoe, I've included the link in the document, but This is a live link that you can click on, find it in a voting code, and you'll basically answer this question on the screen. What do you hope to learn from this workshop? So this, oh, thank you. This is not a question I'm grading you on. I really just would love to know what you're hoping to get out of our time together. So let me go to the Mentimeter itself. And if you're having issues, let me
Marianne,
know.
I had a question. Are people's
Sure.
responses, is their name recorded with it, or is it kind of anonymous?
It's anonymous. That's a
Oh,
great
okay.
question. And you can access this whether you're on your phone, Padlet, or your computer like I am. So you just go to that link, add in the voting code.
They're not asking me for the code for some reason on the website. Does that mean I'm automatically on? For some reason.
Oh, okay. Also, I can see someone's name. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that could happen. I thought it was completely anonymous, but your answer will be anonymous, I assume. Okay, so resources, new resources for primary text to use in your classroom, new ways to incorporate Black history into my US history curriculum. Wonderful. And I will share my slides with you in a PDF format after the workshop, and I will include this slide as well. I hope to learn more about unseen female figures in history. So some of the stories that we tell in WAMS, they're women like Eleanor Roosevelt, or they're women like Polly Murray, who her story is being reinserted into the narrative since she was such a big influence of RBG, since her works were used in that Brown versus Board of Ed decision. So she is being discussed today, which is really exciting. But I hadn't heard of her even through my schooling. Okay, to use this knowledge in class while writing discussion boards and learn more about women in history, using primary sources to be culturally responsive. So I'm seeing a lot of hoping to learn new strategies, the content, looking at ways to engage your students, also to learn about more women in history, women who came before or influenced women like Kamala Harris, our VP, Hillary Clinton, and so forth. Great. Thank you all for trying that out. I hope it was easy enough to navigate. We have one at the end that we'll try time pending, time permitting. Okay, so with all of our workshops, we always take a moment to review the group norms, the community protocols, so that we have a set of guidelines to engage with not only each other, but with the sources. So let's take a moment to look at this together. Okay, as a community, can we agree to these group norms? You can write yes in the chat box, you can give a thumbs up. I see some of you nodding. Great. No, I love your enthusiasm. Absolutely, in all caps. Thank you, Andrew, for the
Yeah, I
thumbs
try to
up.
be nice usually and friendly.
I appreciate that. Okay, cool. All right, we can move on. And our essential questions that will focus our content: how were Black women active agents for change during the civil rights movement of the 1940s? What challenges did they face? What successes did they achieve? How can we use primary sources and strategies from this workshop to engage our students in understanding the critical role of African American women in the Black freedom struggle, and how can this workshop provide historical context on the Black Lives Matter movement of today? So I think someone is making marks on my slides or on the screen. Is that just me, or can you see the yellow lines? You can see the yellow lines. That's okay. I don't know how to get rid of them, but I think we're good with those. Okay. All right, so how do we even begin to access this information, especially with our students? I did see someone wrote that they would love to teach kindergartners after you have your college degree, and you can teach our littles about the civil rights movement, about race, about what it means to be a citizen in this country, in this world. So one way you can begin to have that conversation at all levels is through visual inquiry. So at the New York Historical Society, we want everyone from adults to students to really young ones to know that they are part of this research and investigation of primary sources from long ago. So we always start with observations, which honestly is the moment where you suspend everything that you know and you only focus on what is in front of you. So if it's an image or if it's an object, it gives everyone equal footing to contribute to what they see. The next step would be for me as the facilitator to guide you through a series of questions that dive deeper into your observation. So if you're seeing an object that is blue, it could be a question as simple as, well, why is this blue? What was its purpose? Where would it have been made? And then our inferences will have us reflecting on the larger society where an object or an image was created within and what it tells us about the culture, the civilization, and so on. So we're going to try that out together. Just ease into it. It's all good. No one's getting graded. So again, just hope you have fun with it. Or at least see that some images aren't so different than what we're seeing today. So with this image, please do not write in the chat yet. I will ask for responses in the next slide. What I want you to do is let's do a minute, and you can write down what you see on a piece of paper, or you can just mentally keep a log of it. And then I'll guide you through some questions. Okay, everyone. So I gave you a minute to look. In the next slide, I'll walk you through some questions and you will see the citation, which is underneath the image of this event. So Underwood and Underwood, silent protest parade in New York City against East St. Louis riots in 1917 from our friends at the Library of Congress. Can't see the questions because I haven't put them up yet. So here's the first one, which is, what do you see? So you can write in the chat what you see in the image. Be simple details, could be colors. I see a group of Black women wearing white being led by a Black man in a suit. I see a protest of African American women protesting and a bunch of USA flags, protest sign, Black women dressed in all white dresses marching, female Black individuals who are participants in this protest. Everyone is wearing white, a sign that says independence. Many Black women marching and protesting. Anything else? Can you tell me about the background that they are marching in, or what's around them? Buildings, yeah. A downtown setting. How do you know it's downtown? Here's they're on a city block, there's streets. Looks like a city. See a lot of Black women wearing white, see a lot of flags. So I guess during World War I, based on the style of clothing, yes. Tall buildings, so most likely New York, even if you didn't use the citation at the bottom to gain more context. You are noticing that it's an urban landscape. It looks like men are watching from the sidewalks. Yeah, white suits and signs. Okay. So this is a protest. It's a silent protest. The women marching are not speaking, and all anyone heard as far as the reports of the event was the muffled sound of drums. So what tactics are they using to get attention, right? If a protest is to bring awareness to something, how are they doing that? Civil disobedience, yeah. Big signs, lots of people. And this photograph is just a snippet of the 10,000 African Americans marching down Fifth Avenue in New York City. So you were right, for those of you who guessed this was New York. Reminds you of the Women's Suffrage March of 1915, yeah. Why does it remind you of that march? Is there something in particular that makes you think of other marches or the suffrage marches? You're all doing great. This is really, I miss doing this. It's been a while. What they're wearing, absolutely. So Zoe was talking about in her lecture about who is an activist today and who wasn't included before. And here we see that cross, that intersection of here are Black women who are also suffragists in 1917 marching. It reminds me of marches that took place in recent history, such as the Women's March in 2017. Yeah, I was actually happened to be walking along Fifth Avenue yesterday, and it's a very public place. Now there are a lot of stores there, but here, one day in 1917, we had 10,000 Black Americans, and it's actually not just women, they're actually children also marching, wearing white. There were police escorts at the front. There were prominent NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, present as well, and then men in, Black men in dark suits as well. So we talked about who is in this photo a little bit. Any other thoughts on why the marchers are all Black, actually, and some of them are children? But don't forget that Black women weren't welcomed in the marches by their peers. Yes, they weren't. You're absolutely right. That within the suffrage movement, there were divisions. There was the upholding of racism and And the vote hadn't even passed yet, sorry, 1917. The marches are all Black because there were a lot of racism. There was a lot of racism back then, absolutely, still today. And actually this march comes out of riots that happened in East St. Louis that would inevitably lead to the lynching and displacement and really the terrorism of Black communities in East St. Louis. Gabrielle, white women use racism to argue for the right to vote. Yeah, so that was one aspect of a story that we are complicating, who gets to be a suffragist in that time period. And so this event, I think we touched on it, it is talking about the enormous amount of racism that Black Americans are facing. So those were those 3 steps, or 2 steps that we just went through, the observations and then diving deeper into it. Before we get to these 2 questions, some more context. This was the second time that African Americans collectively demonstrated in the way you're seeing. In 1918, a similar protest would happen in Newark, New Jersey. And the NAACP had just formed and was actually a moment of interracial cooperation, but it was decided that Black Americans would be in the march to show the racism that is affecting Black Americans in this country. Interestingly, you had Black Boy Scouts who would hand out flyers to the watchers of the parade. White people stopped and wondered what was happening. And so looking at these 2 questions, yep, this event was getting African Americans to protest against racism, and really the very violent act of racism that was happening with the rise of anti-Black groups, which we will talk about in the next source. So looking at this image, any thoughts on what this can tell us about the experiences of African American communities in the US in the early 20th century? What challenges did they face? How did they work to address these challenges? Think about how it might have been to march in this parade, to be very exposed in a big city like New York. It's always something I tell myself too. Yeah, there's a lot of hurtful things. The everyday indignities to be Black in the United States. Their voices weren't heard, so they needed to march to be heard. Yeah, and the collective power of, or the visual power of seeing this collective in front of you. And they were silent too. Yeah, that's the interesting thing. That silence was so loud that it stopped Fifth Avenue. Anyone else? This tells us that Black people were facing such discrimination that they were willing to expose themselves in the street to possible police brutality. And this is something we still see today when you're marching in New York City and cities across the country. The police were escorting this group of marchers, but we know from media today and media then that wasn't always the case. Okay. Oh, also claiming their constitutionally guaranteed civil rights, yeah, to assemble, to protest, to challenge inequality in the wake of a violent attack. I would also add on to that, being together to grieve the violence, the fear, the danger of existing as a Black person in the country. Definitely very difficult because of political and social aspects, such as discriminatory laws and white nationalism like the Ku Klux Klan, KKK. Yes, even a century later, we still see this with the collective mourning of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless unarmed Black folks who haven't made the news as well. Okay, so Robert mentioned the KKK, and we are actually going to look at a document featured in WAMS about the women of the Ku Klux Klan. Oh, yes, the sign. Before we get to that, thank you for mentioning that. It calls back to the history of Crispus Attucks, who was killed in the Boston Massacre, of the long fight for equality for Black Americans even before the country was founded. Okay, so this content warning, I do think that it is the responsibility of educators to be very sensitive about real sources that are very triggering. So this is what our department has come up with. The following primary source, Women of the Ku Klux Klan, contains hate speech that upholds the system of white supremacy. We as educators recognize that it was racist, offensive, and disturbing at the time of creation, and that it continues to be so today. By exploring this content, we aim to acknowledge how Black Americans faced violence at multiple levels in US society and provide historic context for the stories of resilience we will explore throughout the rest of this workshop. So when we mean multiple levels of violence, rhetorical, physical, emotional, spiritual, economic violence as well. Okay, so the Women of the Ku Klux Klan, their manifesto, published in the 1920s. This source was provided by Yale University in the archives. In all of our documents, as you might see if you've clicked on the resource, we have the actual document text and then a summary provided by our curriculum writers. Because of the nature of this language, I'm only going to read the summary portion of it, which is still pretty violent, but it says, we believe that American blood must be kept pure. America must avoid racial pollution. We believe that neither immigrants nor people of inferior races should be allowed to control the government. We believe that the women of the Ku Klux Klan will uphold these beliefs and the nation's racial purity. Members work to protect homes and children, maintain happiness, and make America prosperous. I'll just give us a moment. Yes, Robert, this was partly inspired by the eugenics movement, which is happening at this time. This is also happening at a time where the borders are being created in the United States to keep out immigrants. The resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan had happened. It was really prominent in places like Indiana and Iowa and Oregon. And so this is in full a source that I wanted to share with you because yes, we have to know and explore and learn and engage with stories of Black activism, but I think we also need to understand what they are being activist against, right? So here is the rhetoric that solidifies white supremacy and upholds it. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then through this discussion, provide more context for who the WKKK are. So who are the members of the Women of the Ku Klux Klan? Who might they be? And what are their goals? So we'll start with that first question. Wives or descendants of ex-Confederate soldiers, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, white women that supported racism, great grandmothers, aunts, mothers. Yeah, so I could be very well connected to what I saw someone write, the lost cause mythology. So rewriting the end of the Civil War as a noble defeat by the Confederate, which was not true. White women suffragists. The KKK of the 1920s was throughout the country, strongest in Indiana, not just the South. Yep, yes. There were thousands of members in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, middle-class white women. Often they were wives of Klansmen, and they were white Protestant, and they were feminist, interestingly enough, who very much supported the ideology of white supremacy, fundraised for it, held picnics, organized church gatherings, but didn't actually partake in the violence because they believed that was something that the Klansmen did. But they supported it. They always wore white masks. What do you mean by they were feminists? That's a really good question. In the document, there is, let me grab that document. So if you look here, one of the lines is very interesting. We believe in the mission of emancipated womanhood, freed from the shackles of old world traditions and standing unafraid in the full effulgence of equality and enlightenment. So think about what that is saying, right? As women of the Klan, what are they advocating for themselves? This is, I think some of you said they might have been white women's suffrages, and they were. So they're simultaneously supporting the expansion of voting rights for women while also upholding to deny it for anyone who wasn't white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay. Keep those answers in the chat or keep them going. False sense of supremacy over other races. They were trying to say that it should not be based on gender. So women for them were just white women who were Protestant. So at this time, the Klan starts targeting Jewish people, Catholic people, along with Black Americans and people of color, immigrants. So, okay, based on this document, how do the women of the Klan view African Americans? Lesser than. Yeah, and to the point where so less than that the language is racial pollution. They viewed them as inferior and felt they don't deserve to have government positions. Yes, and that's coming out of Black men elected to local government, to being senators in the US during the Reconstruction period. So as civil rights for Black American men are being scaled back and retracted, the Klan is emerging once more. I would say they do not treat African Americans well and that they are very exclusive towards them. There is that, yes, and then dive deeper into the actual violence and lynching that comes from that rhetoric of thinking a group is less than. They're interested in advancing their own power and rights in a white male-dominated society, and they see the best way to do that is making an alliance with white supremacy. Yes, with the men who have the power, the white men who are in power. And some statistics that I was reading earlier today, that there's still a KKK membership throughout the country. As of 2017, those recent groups in 2017 were formed around 2014. So think about what is happening at that time in American society, what elections are coming up, what happens when Donald Trump is elected into the office. And I can share those resources in our links document. Okay. Okay, so final question for this source. How can this document, or knowing the bit we have learned about the WKKK, how can it inform our current understanding of Black Americans' collective activism against white supremacy, both past and present? 1 million Black servicemen marched in World War II. Ida B. Wells documented the lynchings in her book, The Red Record, which I saw in person in our exhibit in 2020. And she did this out of her own friend being lynched and then being found not guilty after he had died. And so she was moved in a very powerful way, an unfortunate way, to do this research. Anything else you learn about Black activism in the US based on this document? I think it's interesting that we still use the same tactics, such as protest march in New York, to gain attention for movement goals. And we have even expanded to social media, to hashtags, to Facebook Lives. I was just thinking about that, Instagram Lives, and being there recording protests as they're happening. There is actually videos of the silent protest. I think they should be available online since it's Library of Congress, and it is incredible to see that marching happening and to know maybe you have been to a march yourself and see how that parallels. Okay. Any final thoughts on this document? White supremacy today is open and explicit and deliberate. I would even say it became even more open during the last presidency, too, and with the rise of social media. Do you know in what state this was published? That's a good question. Let's see if citation shows it. I don't know where this was published. What I do know is the women of the KKK were formed around 1923. They merged from different women's clan groups, such as Queens of the Golden Mask and Ladies of the Invisible Empire. White supremacy today is violent. It was also violent then too. We can see how white supremacy still persists in society today as Black voters continue to be suppressed. So we are seeing a lot of parallels here. Okay, so we are going to shift from looking at the rhetoric of white supremacy and that particular history to the stories of resilient Black women activists who lived through seeing the Klan in their everyday lives or being in those areas. I think many of you, I hope you had the chance to read these life stories. So Mary McLeod Bethune, who was at the time the highest ranking Black woman in office before Kamala Harris, Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote one of my favorite books, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and Polly Murray, a legal scholar, influence of RBG, is featured in our exhibit. So thank you, Zoe, for adding the links. There is a Padlet that you will work on in a group. So we're going to put you into breakout groups in just a moment. You'll have 15 minutes to work with each other. I ask and I invite all of you to turn on your videos once you're in your breakout rooms. You can take a minute to settle in. I know it takes a bit of time, but what you are going to do, everyone, you have just received the link to the Padlet in the chat, so I would click on that. On the left, on the column on the left-hand side, you'll see the links to those life stories. And then in part one, I give you explicit directions. You're not going to write anything for this part, but you are going to nominate a timekeeper. If you want, you can choose the person who had the most recent birthday. I would like the timekeeper to track 2 minutes for each person so that you each have equal time to talk about and reflect on the woman that you read about. You can use the discussion questions. What issues did this woman care about? How did her race, class, age, and gender identity shape her activism in the time they lived in? What new information or perspectives did you gain about the ongoing civil rights movement from this life story or the long civil rights movement? Nope, this is the same post. And then part 3 is when you're going to nominate a note taker to record your group's answer to this question. How can these life stories inform our understanding of the critical role African-American women played in the Black freedom struggle? And to add a text box, all you have to do is click this plus sign that my mouse is hovering over. You can write your answer, publish it, and then there you go. You can also delete it. All right, so does that make sense, everyone, what we're gonna do next? If you have a question, let me know. If you want to vocally ask about the activity or write in the chat, feel free to do so now. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I think Joe is gonna send you into breakout groups for, yeah, let's do 15 minutes. Hello, everyone.
Hey.
We have about 30 seconds until all the rooms are closed and everyone is back.
Gabriella, you look familiar. Didn't you teach at Montclair High?
Yeah.
Robert, don't you teach in the school system? The Montclair one?
What?
I was asking Robert a question.
Oh.
Noah, you were a student at Montclair High School, is that right?
No.
Yes, I was from 2014
sorry.
to 2018.
Great.
I grew up in Montclair. I hope to teach in Montclair after I have my degree.
It's a great place. My sister lives nearby and very cool to be there. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Thank you to those who were able to contribute to the Padlet. It's okay if you didn't. I hope you were able to discuss the stories or at least look through them very quick. This Padlet, the permissions will be open for you to write in it after the workshop if you want to test out this resource that I've been using since March 2020. So I feel like Padlet and I are one and the same sometimes. But I really enjoyed seeing your answers to the questions about how these stories can inform your understanding of the role of Black women in the long civil rights movement. Did anyone, before I call in some of the answers you wrote, does anyone want to share any reflections about the activity or just about the stories in general? You can unmute yourself if you'd like. It'd be great to hear some of your voices.
I learned a lot about Zora Neale Hurston, about she was one of the famous novelty authors during the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is at the end, she died in obscurity until, she was rediscovered in a way, right? And how many of you read Their Eyes Were Watching God in school, possibly? Maybe saw the Halle Berry movie version that Oprah produced. I saw that. Yep. So that's how I came to know of her. But there's so much about her story that isn't often told either. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
If I could just piggyback off of that, there was as
Sure.
we were kind of talking in our group, we were in the same group. I read Their Eyes Were Watching God in my EP lit class in high school.
Mhm.
Almost 10 years ago. And I have that book on my bookshelf back home, and it was one of my favorites that I had read because how authentic it was And I think that was one thing that Zora Neale Hurston like prided herself on and really found importance, was to accurately portray Black culture and folklore and dialect and represent it in her works. That way, it really reflected an accurate portrayal and depiction of that culture. And like, I didn't even know that she was buried in an unmarked grave. And like,
Yeah.
at the end of her life, she was in a welfare home. She didn't have a lot of money. She had suffered. She would like was working and as like a maid, a teacher, a clerk, just to get by. And it's very depressing and unfortunate that, you know, like present day, we look back and we see a lot of these, you know, influential figures in history. And at the time, they were relatively unknown.
Yeah.
But just to see like how much they've made an impact on things, you know, years after they're gone.
And thank you so much, Scarlett. I think you're touching on how scholarship changes and the way we see literature changes, because the way she wrote was so controversial, which I think gets to the heart of how do you show the humanity of a culture. You don't show it in one way. Everyone had their different opinions in the Harlem Renaissance, in the collective activism section of Black America, or aspect of Black America. And Zora Neale Hurston really captures that in her life. I thought it was interesting too. She is from the South, and even though, yes, it was very dangerous, she called it her home. So that's something to consider, that out of the terrors of the South, we have figures like Martin Luther King, we have Pauli Murray, we have Zora Neale Hurston. So those are things I'm often mindful of, being from the Northeast. Okay, thank you all. Oh, let me check the chat.
I left
Okay, I wanted-
a,
Oh, go ahead.
oh, no, I had, during our group, I just learned of Pauli Murray.
Mhm.
And I put the link to the trailer, which is how I learned about Pauli Murray. There's a film called My Name is Pauli Murray.
Yes, that's right.
Which, yeah, just released this year. So other than this is essentially the second reference that I've come across to her. So with that said, very clearly and concisely, I know nothing about Pauli Murray, but I'm on the path to
Yes.
learn some things about Pauli Murray.
Very well said, I think.
Yeah, that, like I said, is the second reference to her. The Mary McLeod Bethune and Zora Neale Hurston, and the three of them. I'm curious. I don't know if curious is the, excuse me, is the right term, but I'm just the framework of the activity, so to say. Obviously that these, and obviously they're not the only ones, but that these three women that were chosen for those reasons represent different, from my perspective, different types of existence in the United States. They're all working to and living to navigate literally their existence within these United States, which is a hostile environment. Not just only on gender terms, but obviously the construct, the racial construct terms and other things. So that's one observation, immediate observation, touching all three, which goes to the question about, oops, I'm sorry. How did race, class, age, and gender identity shape their activism excuse me, in the time that they lived in? Overall, are we engaged, is this entire program addressing resistance within the United States? due to the nature of the founding of the country and its history and the people that were involved in? Or are we just solely focusing on aspects of Black life under the guise of Black history leading up to the Black, or at least, I'm sorry, the movement, the global movement for Black lives, which started off as Black Lives Matter movement, if that makes sense.
Zoe, I don't know if you want to jump in, but I had some thoughts on that. And yes to both, in that we did look at the everyday lives of Black figures like Mary Bethune, but also how everyday actions of these people would influence and lead to the global movement we are in today as well. And so without acknowledging the extraordinary aspects of their life and the everyday aspects, I think you don't get a sense of the person as a whole, which is what WAMS is trying to combat, that these are everyday people who can make change, just like we're seeing today, and people who are being illuminated in the media, or youth activists as well. So those are just some of my thoughts. And I do want to be mindful of time as well, and some things I saw in the chat about Polly Murray's pronouns, which is constantly being debated. I know in their papers, Polly referred to themselves as she, and went and had a few different names throughout their lives too. So that was interesting. I'm glad, Dawn, you had a discussion about the way Polly Murray should be referred when we're talking about Polly Murray and an educational aspect versus as the person moving through the world, if you will. So think about the terminology, the language, the space, the support that Polly didn't have to be able to identify as non-binary at that point too.
We did feel it was really important to be able to discuss Polly Murray in class to give students a voice who might not have that voice. And it was really interesting in terms of the intersectionality of her, or there, his race, gender, and sexuality, and just, you know, the influence we discussed on the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And really, really interesting person that I'd never heard of before.
We actually, when I first started working and collaborating with Zoe, Polly Murray's story hadn't been published yet in WAM. So we've used Polly's story in a workshop about LGBTQ plus history, in the Black freedom struggle workshop that we're in. And so for someone who contributed to the reason why someone that looks like me is in an American public school system, or was, is really incredible to teach now as a museum professional and as a teacher. So thank you for bringing Polly into that space in so much more too. It's so much more of a complex and appreciative way, at least for me. Okay,
yeah,
so
I also feel like,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like Polly's story just kind of shows how when it comes to I guess like people that have been marginalized in history, that like historians really do have to like dig very deep to find some of these stories, because it's not like in a survey US history class, it's not necessarily a story that you would delve into, because it's like Polly's contribution to Brown v. Board was like through writing, you know, a paper in law school that was read by what, you know, so it's like, you know, it's like, you know, a few like people like down the line to kind of find their story. So it just kind of shows like, you really do have to be, I don't know, like determined and really care about these stories to go about looking for them, because since, you know, marginalized people were marginalized, they didn't get to be the front and center. They didn't get to be Thurgood Marshall and whatnot, or whatever, you know what I'm trying to say, even though he was marginalized as well as a Black man, but still like he had a little bit more power and privilege because of his gender. So yeah, it just kind of just shows, you know, and of course these stories are important because students have to see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and then also like even students that don't identify with being LGBTQ need to understand that it's not new, you know, that this is that it's not a new thing for people to struggle, right, with gender identity.
And to be Black and queer, non-binary, that is also part of the activism we need to center as well, right? To be all of these identities, as Polly was, but didn't have the things they could process, the tools they could process their identity the way we do now in some spaces. So I'm glad we're ending on that note on Polly's story. I know it's time to go. I didn't get a chance to share this, but in the follow-up, you'll have links to Elizabeth Catlett's linoleum cuts. And she was an artist who was the granddaughter of enslaved Africans, who her art was so controversial that the US barred her from re-entering the country of her birth. And she ended up renouncing her citizenship and becoming a Mexican citizen. And so these are just one of many works of art, and I thought this would be a great way to end our workshop. My role has been important in the struggle to organize the unorganized. I think by looking at these stories of Black women, some who we have heard of, some who we haven't, I hope that this work of art can give you more things to think about with your students. There is also an art integration activity that goes along with it. There is a Mentimeter prompt as well, just thinking about how it makes you feel and how it would make your students feel, which is something you always want to consider with works of art. Emotions are very much what we want to center as well. And then the reflection question, if you have any thoughts on how you might incorporate these sources in your classroom, feel free to add them to the chat. I know Dawn and some of you were saying you're excited to use Polly's story, and that makes me really happy to know their story is being told to more students, and hope that it helps them navigate their identities as well. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to share these resources and to hear from you, and of course Zoe and the Montclair community for having NYHS here.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
Maria.
Yeah, that was a terrific program, and thank you so much to all of you who joined us here today. I just wanted to close out by saying this was a wonderful workshop. I've dropped a lot of material and links in the chat room in the last 2 minutes. So we'll stay online for a couple of minutes so you can check those out if you're interested. I'll send a follow-up email that will have a link to a recording of this session, as well as follow-up materials that we've been dropping in the chat. So we'll send you a nice organized list of those resources. Finally, we have a Holocaust education program on campus on November 12th. It is an all-day in-person workshop. We ask you to be vaccinated for that one, to come to campus and to do that workshop, and it will be featuring a survivor of the Holocaust. So if you're interested, please let me know and I can help you get signed up. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. I'll stick around here for a few minutes, and Marian will stick around in case you have any questions. Yep. Otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I